Welcome to Artistic Adventures. We're into part 8, and this is Witch Winifred. We're going to work on her dress, and that's about all we got done because at 9 o'clock, Game of Thrones comes on, and all work must end for that. So let's get started. Okay, so we're just going to be doing the dress that's under this cloak, and it's a green dress with a purple insert. That picture doesn't really show it, so I'm going to show you another picture that shows a little bit more detail. So it's like a green overdress and a purple, probably was an underdress that was gathered with this gold thread. I'm just going to do it as a purple insert because I don't want to put a purple dress under a green dress. It's just going to be too bulky and I don't think it's going to work well on this smaller figure. So here's the purple material that I'll be using. And the green material that I'm using is the same type of material. I think this is just 100% polyester. It's kind of a thin draping material, nothing special. So the first thing I want to do is just measure from kind of the top of her chest to her feet because that's where this purple insert is located. And I'm just going to cut out a sort of rectangular piece that I feel will be about the size that I want because it's going to be gathered and that will give it the look that we want. So just trimming that salvage edge off, and then we have our purple rectangular piece. And then this is going to be the green fabric that we use, and it's I think pretty much the same fabric, and I think they match the costume pretty well also, so I'm pretty happy with that. So the first thing I'm going to do is look at the length and cut out a piece so that I can maneuver it a little bit easier as far as cutting it out. So I'm just going to lay this purple piece down beside of it. That will give me the length because that's going to be at her chest. So I need to cut this up more to be at her shoulder and include a seam allowance. And we're going to get rid of that salvage edge. And then we're going to lay the doll down and kind of take a look at how wide this needs to be because the front is going to be split. And that will be on either side of the purple gathered undergarment, which is really just going to be a purple insert. And so I'm just going to cut out a scoop here for the neck. One thing I really like these scissors, and they are great for cutting fabric, but they are a little big, I've learned over the last few videos. So cutting out like necklines and stuff is not exactly the easiest. They are super sharp and they work really great for cutting out fabric. Probably more intended for the larger scale human body cutting out fabric. But for longer pieces or whatever, I still like them because they cut really well. They cut fabric just like butter. So I'm just going to eyeball this. You know how I work. I don't have a pattern. And I just got to cut it out the way I see it. So I'm going to cut out what I feel would be the side of the front, one side. And I'm going to just angle it up with the bottom a little bit fuller than the top. Keeping in mind that these dolls are so thin. It's really hard sometimes to get things to fit them properly. But just keep that in mind as you're making your cuts. So we're going to cut it up here, and then I'm going to cut out the sleeve. And I'm making it just sort of a narrow sleeve because she's going to have that cloak on over it. We'll talk about this later. Yeah, that was an adventure. Okay, so got that front part cut out. I'm just trimming up under the arm there. And just going to put it up against her to see how I think that looks. I'm going to turn over a hem on the front, and also I'll have to allow for a seam under the arm. And the sleeves are super long, so I'm just going to cut off some of that. And I think the rest looks pretty good. So what we're going to do is cut out another one in the opposite direction. Although this material is, I think it's pretty much the same on both sides. I'm just trying to make sure that I have the same look. So I'm going to cut it out in the opposite direction. So we're just cutting out the other side of the front and trimming up the neckline. I kind of had to get out my little bitty scissors. Got so many different size scissors. Now for the back, what I want to do here is I do want to have the back have an opening because the front part is going to all be sewn together. Even though it looks gathered, it's going to be all sewn together. So I'm going to make the back so that it's a little bit bigger than the front to allow for a seam and then to turn down the edges of the opening at the center back at the neckline. So I'm just going to lay out my front pieces and allow for extra material in between them. And this was really actually turned out to be too much. Ended up having to really overlap it a lot in the back. So you could almost have done this the same in the front as the back because we are doing that sort of overlap to do the purple insert. So that was one little mistake I made, but yeah, we worked it out. It's an adventure. So I'm just cutting out the back and then I'll eventually cut, there you go, right up the middle. And you'll be able to tell the back from the front because the back is just a little bit bigger. Just a tad. And that really wasn't necessary after I finished. Now for the back neckline, I didn't cut as big a scoop. I did put fray check all around the edges. This just really saves you a lot because it makes the sewing so much easier, keeps it structured, and keeps it from unraveling. Although this particular material didn't unravel a lot, it does unravel a little bit. All right, so this is the front. You can see my scoop neck there where I'm got my finger. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn that down on the sewing machine and then turn the front part over that's going to be attached to the purple part. So I did that off camera. And then for the next part, I'm going to sew the back center seam up to about 3 inches from the neckline. A little bit further than that, actually, about there, about 3 inches. I'm going to sew down to the hem and then turn the other edges over up to the neckline. All right, so now we've got the front part with the neckline and the front centerpiece hemmed to both sides. All right, and then that purple piece is going to go in between there and we're going to gather it up. Like magic. It's going to be like magic, just like witchery. All right, now the next thing we're going to do is I did not hem the neckline of the back, so I'm going to do that. I did hem the opening of the back where we're going to be able to get the dress on and off the doll and do the center back seam. So I've got to go back to the sewing machine and turn under the neckline right there, just a little tiny bit. And then what we'll do is attach the front to the back at the shoulder and the top of the sleeve. So we'll sew the seam from the shoulder down to the top of the sleeve to the end of the sleeve. All right, so we've got that done on both sides, and I also hemmed the bottom of the sleeve. All right, so that's the top of the sleeve, and then I hemmed the bottom of the sleeve. And it's easier to hem like this while you've got it open than to sew it together and then try to hem it. You'd have to use hand sewing at that point. All right, so if you put the doll in here, you can see how big that back part is. So it's way too big. All right, and then I'm just sort of measuring, and I also find that the front is pretty big. So when I sew the purple part sew this to the purple part, I'm going to actually turn up an additional hem than what I've already done. And then I think that should do it. And then I can just fold the back part over each other and sew it, and that'll be fine. It doesn't matter that it's a little bit loose, because she's going to have that velvet sort of cloak thing over it, or over robe over it. The rest looks pretty good, the underarms and the length. So we're going to work on this purple piece next. And I did put the fray check on this piece as well. I'm going to get some thread that's pretty much the same color as the fabric, and thread my needle in magical speed made possible by editing. And then I'm just going to turn up. This is going to be at the top. I'm going to turn this under for a hem, and sew just a straight back stitch across the front there. This ends up not showing very much, so I mean, if you wanted to sew it on the sewing machine, you could. I just didn't want to have to change thread because I'm using mostly green right now. So while I'm sitting here, I'm listening to different things on my iPad, and it's actually kind of enjoyable to sew. I don't know, it just sort of takes your mind away. You don't think about anything bad or anything that's going on in the world. You're just looking at your stitches and listening to whatever, and it's kind of cool. All right, so we're going to speed through this. Just a basic back stitch all the way across. And then once that's complete, we're going to do a gathering thread just a little tiny bit down from the top. A gathering thread, you're just going in and out with the needle. And then we're going to pull it and gather that whole piece together at the top. So probably, like I said, the way I think this dress was made, it was probably had a purple dress underneath that was really loose and flowy, and then that green dress over it sort of cinched it all together with the lacing. But that would have been really hard to do, I think, on the doll, so I'm going to do it this way. I'm sure there's lots of ways to do it, but we're going to do it this way on this video. And if you want to do it a different way, you're welcome to do that, because it's all about being creative and making yourself feel good about what you accomplish. All right, so I'm just sort of measuring there where I want the top of it to be. And then I want to put another gathering thread right around the waist area. So I measured that, and I'm going to just go through with the needle and do the same thing, in and out, real loose thread, and then we're going to pull it and gather it, and this will keep the top part in a gathered shape so we can do the work that we need to do on it to make it look like the dress. So you can see there, it's nice and gathered at the top. You just pull it and it sort of gathers on its own, just like that. All right, that's really kind of how it looks underneath the dress on the picture. Now, one of the things that she has on this top part here is gold lacing, and probably the lacing went back and forth from the green, but we're going to do it on the purple, and then we're going to sew the green on top of it to give it the look that we want. So I'm cutting out a fairly long piece, probably about a yard, and then I go from the back, twist it in the front, go back around the back, because I want to tie it in place so that it stays with that amount. And then we're going to do a similar thing like we did with Wtich Sarah to do the lacing. It's funny, they all had kind of different kinds of lacing. Like Mary had the little gold hoops that we laced through. This one's going to be just a little bit different, because you don't really see lacing hoops or anything like that on the pictures Just looks like lacing. Might have even been a sort of decorative thing, but anyway, I'm turning it over here. I'm going to take the two long ends and tie them into a loose knot so that where I've crossed it over stays in place in the back. I don't want to pull this too tight because remember we're going to sew the green on either side of it. So if we pull it too tight, it won't look right for us to sew that down. So just a loose knot just to keep it in place. And we're going to flip it back over. And I'm going to take one side and put a needle on that gold thread. This is really fine. Gold thread, it was no problem threading it through the needle at all. It's very, very fine. It doesn't fray on the end either, which is really nice. All right, so we've left one side open, and we're going to do this like we did on Sarah's bodice. And the first stitch I'm doing here, I'm going to tie a knot in it just to hold it tight. And then we're going to go back and forth, but I'm not going all the way to the edge of the fabric. I'm picking up the fabric about 1/4 of an inch away from the edge because we're going to sew the green down on the side, and I want to have that part available. So it'll look like the gold thread is coming from the green because we're going to sew it right beside of it, if that makes sense. All right, and then I'm doing the same thing over on the other side, picking up that fabric, and then we're just going to go back and forth, but we're leaving enough space to come back with the other thread and go in between so it'll look like a lacing. That's just like if you laced your shoe and you did one lace first and then went back and did the other lace. You know what I'm saying? If that makes sense. So now I'm just going back and forth, and I speeded this up a little bit because this was just tedious. And I think this is self-explanatory. If you wanted to use a thicker lacing, you could do that and maybe just sew it down on the sides instead of trying to, thread it through the fabric. But this, I think this looks really similar to how the picture looks. Doesn't look like it's really, really thick like Mary's was. Mary's looked a lot thicker, I thought, and was more appropriate for it to go through the rings. So this is cool. I like this. All right, so we're up at the top. I'm going to go over here to the side, pull this, and then I'm going to put a knot in it, do a loop, and then put my needle through that. And then I'm just going to leave that loose for now. And we're going to go back to the other side down at the bottom and thread that piece through our needle. I like that this is kind of stiff, so it's really easy to thread the needle. And then we'll do the same thing. The first stitch will be just to do a stitch to sort of set it in place so that it doesn't pull the fabric once you get started doing the back and forth. So we're going to just do a little knot there to hold it. Just go through the loop with your needle and that holds it in place. And now we'll go back and forth in between the ones that we did on the other side to make it look like lacing. This thread, it's a little bit stiff, but I thought it worked pretty well overall. I was happy with it. I always have this on hand as well as some silver, because there's always things that I end up doing that I need some gold and silver thread for. So these are one of the things I just sort of keep around. I didn't have to go out and buy it, thank goodness. I bought so much material for this project, that's plenty. I don't need to spend any more money. Although I did buy those cute little stockings for Winifred there. The green and black stockings with the bow on them. They just were too perfect to ignore. Sometimes you got to do it. You just got to get it. And sometimes you just make do with what you have. All right, so we've got those two threads finished, and we tied knots on the back, on the top, so they won't come out. And I did trim those up a little bit. So now it's time to attach the sides of the green, and this is where it's nice that you don't have it, the dress, the green part all sewed together. We can sew it down with the two front parts fairly separate. All that's attached is really the shoulder seams. So we're just going to put it on either side so that it sort of looks like it meets right where the gold thread comes out. And I did pin it down just to show you I was a good girl, pinned it down. I sewed it, and I'm taking these out. I don't know if any of you have figured out yet that I made a big mistake, but I have. I'll tell you about it later, but see if you can figure out what it is. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and sew down the green part on the other side. Make sure you get those gold threads out of the way while you're doing it. And just line it up and put your pins in all the way down. Makes it a whole lot easier to sew it. And also make sure you keep it in place. You got those two little sides that are, kind of want to fold over, and then you end up sewing them together. So I'm just going to pin this down and sew it, and then I'll be right back for the next step. All right, so we've got it sewed down, and that's how the front looks. And that looks pretty good. So the next part is to sew the underarm sleeve seam and the side seam of the dress. And that's all one long seam. So you just sort of match it up, pin it if you have to. And now it's time to try it on after we turned it, after we sewed it. So the dress itself looks okay. I mean, that's not the problem. The problem is, after I put this on her and I looked at the picture, I realized something. The sleeves. That's the big mistake. Yeah, the sleeves, the dress did not have sleeves made of that material. Yeah, so that was my big mistake. All right, so I went ahead and sewed the dress together in the back just so everything is in the proper shape. So I'm going to have to cut the sleeves off. Yeah, the sleeve material is sort of this black spider webby kind of material. And the neat thing about it is it has this little loop that it kind of holds it onto her finger. I'll show you that in a minute. So before I cut this, what I decided to do was to go ahead and just put the fray check around where I'm going to cut it and let that dry. And then when I cut it, it won't ravel, and also the seam underneath won't come out. All right, so we're ready to cut the sleeves off. So I just trimmed up one side, and then a cut sort of in the middle of the fray check so that it would keep it from unraveling. So there she's got her sleeveless dress now. Oh, it's always an adventure, always an adventure. All right, so this is the material we're going to use for the sleeves. And you see this little point right here that I cut? If you look here, this is the point, and it's a thing that wraps around her middle finger. So what I did off camera before I did this part is I put fray check around on the point and the sides so that I could run this needle through the point, make a loop, and then come back through the point and tie a knot so I have this little loop. And then the little loop is going to go around her middle finger, and then we'll sew the sleeve on. Okay, so that's how that looks. Looks pretty good. The sleeve is a little bit big, so I did trim it down as I was working. And I do the same procedure here as I did with Wtich Sarah. I sewed it on with it on her arm. Right there, I just sewed a knot into the base of my loop so it wouldn't come loose. And it helped that that point there is part of the selvage area, so it was a little bit thicker, because this is really light, very loosely woven. So I'm just trimming it up there, cut off some of the top where it meets the sleeve, and then the sides were a little bit too wide, and you want it to be a little bit narrower at the wrist than at the top too, so it's sort of angled where you cut it. And then you're just going to fold it over on each other and sew on top of it, because it's so spidery looking that you don't see the thread, just looks like part of the weave. So I'm just cutting down the wrist part there to be a little bit more narrow. And you could put fray check on these edges if you wanted to, but I didn't, and it sewed fine. So now you just want to hold it straight, like so it looks like that when it's finished. And then fold one side underneath over the other. And then you're just going to use your needle and thread to go back and forth on the overlap part, so you're catching both sides as you sew. Excuse my hands here, but I'm just trying to get it overlapped and at a place where I can hold it and sew it at the same time, because it's a little bit stiff and didn't want to stay in position for me. But once I get this top part done, you'll be able to see a little bit better. And that's a nice thing, is with the black thread, I mean, you can sew it and sew it, you don't see it because the thread looks like the pattern of the fabric. I always love that, when my mistakes can be hidden. Okay, so now we're ready. We're getting ready to go. And go a little bit faster once we get started. So I had one of the subscribers ask me to list which upcoming projects I have in mind. And I was going to do that on this video, but I ran out of time today, and I'm not going to do it today because I have to watch Game of Thrones, because, I have to. So, sorry about that, but I'll try to do that for the next video when I have a little bit more time. Had a lot of stuff going on this weekend for some reason. It was just a crazy weekend. So there you can see I'm just going in and out over the place where it's overlapped, catching all those little fibers and trying to keep it wrapped around as tightly as possible, because it looks pretty tight on her arm in some of the pictures. So once I get up to the top and I get the lace sewn together at the bottom, then I'm just going to start sewing through the lace and then through the sleeve. Because remember, the sleeve has the fray check on it, so that's a stiff part of the fabric now, and it holds the thread. It won't pull through. Alright, so we're just going to whip through this real quick and get these sleeves on, because it's like 8:54, so I have 6 minutes to get in position with my glass of red wine at the TV. I can upload while I'm sitting at the TV, but this part, the voice part, I can't, so trying to get this done. Alright, so we go all the way around the sleeve, tie it off in a knot under her arm. If you wonder what I'm listening to there on my iPad, I'm actually listening to some studies by Shane J. Wood, who does some really awesome scriptural studies, and I'm just sort of listening to him as I do this. He's pretty awesome. All right, so there we are. That's our finished dress, and next week we're going to be putting that velvet overrobe over, which is going to be fun because it has some designs on it that we're going to paint and stuff. But so far, so good. Witch Winifred is coming along. So we got to do this beautiful overrobe. It's going to be a lot of work, and then we'll do the cape too. We've got to do the cape and the hood just like the other girls have. She's got to have one just like her sister. All right, we did it. We came in before 9 o'clock. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and meet me here next weekend, and we'll do some more work on Winifred. Be sure and subscribe, and thanks a lot.